Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about F1 legends. Welcome back, and we're on to the next decades of this retrospective series, the 90s through the 2000s. For many, this era remains an amazing time and extremely nostalgic, in no small part due to the V10 engines. For those of you who might not have been alive during that time, it's hard to imagine a world where broadcast television reigned supreme and that you had to use VCRs, which are now obsolete, and the term must-see TV. Before we get to our conversation, I need to ask, can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Dick, we have been doing this series of various F1 legends, and I want us to move to more recent times. I think there is probably a lot of people who are listening. Maybe there are people like Dave who they watched F1 for a long period of time, then they kind of fell out of it and then have returned back. So I have a feeling they'll know some of these names. And then maybe there are people like me who have heard these names, watched the videos, and would love to learn a little bit more about these F1 legends that you have curated for us. Of course, as with all the other episodes that we've done on this conversation series, you had to create some type of list of metrics to decide who was going to make the cut. It's not saying that there aren't some really great, amazing champions and drivers, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And if your favorite driver has so far been excluded from the list, the thing to remember is that everybody that we've talked about so far is a multi-time world champion. And there's other guys out there who, like Sterling Moss, are considered one of the all-time greats, but he never won a world championship. And we're going to get to Sir Sterling one of these days. And it ought to be a great conversation because that guy was a fascinating character. But there were other guys like Alberto Ascari. I mean, he was a world champion in the early 1950s that probably most people haven't even heard of, but he was Mario Andretti's hero. And so we're going to go and certainly have that conversation. And today we're going to talk about 3 drivers. And one of those drivers is the hero of one of the other drivers. So, this is one of those things where, it seems to be a common thread that drivers growing up have another hero somewhere. And so, in this case, it's a pretty great story. So I'm looking forward to getting in on this one.
Me too. I think this era, the 90s and 2000s, there's so many great moments that because of the technological video capture as well, we get to have some really amazing moments. So let's start with the first person on your list, Michael Schumacher. Tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, so obviously, I mean, Schumacher is one of the more revered Formula One champions that we've had. He set records that nobody thought would ever be broken. And then, of course, along comes Lewis Hamilton. and so, in some respects, he's tied Schumacher's records, and in other respects, he's broken Schumacher's records. But nonetheless, Schumacher was, kind of the dominant guy during his era. And what's interesting is that Schumacher raced against Senna and Prost, and he raced against guys like Hamilton at one stage and Alonso. And so really, really interesting. This guy really straddled he was the meat and the sandwich that was Prost and Senna versus Alonso and Hamilton, so to speak. And so, and while he did it, he did a whole bunch of winning. What was interesting about him is that, many of these drivers come from either very, very humble surroundings or they come from great wealth. Like Senna came from a very wealthy family, as an example. But Michael Schumacher, along with guys like Fangio and Clark and Jackie Stewart, all those guys, they came from very humble means. even though they wound up being extraordinary drivers. And I think what's really interesting, and this is speaking as a guy who tried to make it as a professional, having family money really helps, because to develop your talent and have that experience to go racing, it just takes money. There's an old saying, the only substitute for cubic inches is cubic dollars. And that really holds true. And yet, in the case of guys like Michael Schumacher, it started from really, really humble beginnings. I mean, his dad was a bricklayer, and he happened to run a local kart track in Kirpen, Germany. And they were doing it as a side hustle just to, make money for the family. And in fact, Schumacher's mom ran the little cafe at the track. So, they worked during the week, whether it was bricklayers or you're looking after the family. And then on the weekends, they were there pretty much every weekend running this facility. And so, needless to say, Michael was exposed to karting at a very early age. And he actually won his first karting championship at the age of 6, which is just crazy. We see it today more and more, but back in those days, that was really kind of unique. But regardless, by the time he was 18, Michael was the European and German karting champion. And by 1990, he had won the German Formula 3 championship. So, he really didn't take a whole lot of time to step from karts into Formula cars and become a champion, which kind of is a testimony to what quality of training that you can get in karting. Anyway.
That's really, really good. I love that, because I know how passionate you are about karting, and how you also are very well aware of the rising talent here in the US and especially in our region. And so I love the way that you just highlighted that. And I think it's such an important thing to note that exposure that he had at such an early age, as you said, was unique for that time. But now it's become more obvious that increasing that exposure increases the opportunity, which then allows for that early discovery of this talent. Would you say that's probably one of the reasons that teams have put even higher attention on those types of things like karting than maybe they did in the past? Or do you think it's always been there?
Yeah, I think today it's even more so, because a lot of these teams like McLaren, they've picked up several young drivers who are still in karting, but they recognize that they may be a star in the making. And so they would rather go in for their long range plans and find, a 12 or 13-year-old, make sure that he's got the best team in karting, that he's running against the very best competition, all of that, and racing in Europe, where it's super, super intense and super competitive, even at the karting level. And by doing that, they're grooming them to be a McLaren driver, so to speak, or whatever, and so, Red Bull has a similar program. And so, it's really important for this to happen, to develop these young kids, because when you think about it, you take a guy that's 6 years old, like Schumacher was when he won his first championship. By the time he's 18, he's got 12 years of racing minimum of experience. And so for him to step into a single seater, okay, he's got to learn about, wings and springs. But I mean, other than that, all his racecraft and all that kind of stuff, he's already got it.
Right, right. And I think when we look back at some of the earlier eras where we talk about like Fangio and Ascari, who you mentioned earlier, people who that's not the way that they entered in. I think that's really cool for you to point that out, because it's something that maybe new fans wouldn't necessarily realize how much time and energy has been placed into these drivers when we finally do see them on the grid. And I'm even thinking about a conversation we had when we released it. It is regarding the Las Vegas race. And you noted at that time, because we were talking about support races for the 2023 Las Vegas Grand Prix. and you had said how your daughter had a classmate who saw Max in a feeder series race. And I think that just kind of ties a kind of a bow on what we're talking about, the value of these different efforts to develop young and rising talent. So, but I feel like I may be getting you off on a tangent. So let's get back to Michael Schumacher.
Yeah.
So you said he won that German F3 championship. Then what happened?
Well, so what happened was Mercedes has had a junior program for quite some time. And so they said, this kid, who knows? He may come right, And so they hired him to drive sports cars. And so he started doing endurance racing in the Mercedes sports cars. And of course, that's not Formula One, but those cars are seriously quick. The competition is good. And of course, in an endurance race, you're getting many, many, many miles on a weekend because the races are much longer than an F1 race. So it's actually a really interesting way to groom a driver. And during that year, Eddie Jordan, who had a Formula One team at the time, and Eddie was absolutely one of those motorsport hustlers in the same kind of ilk as, say, a Bernie Ecclestone was. He spotted Schumacher's talent, and for 1991, Schumacher made his F1 debut at the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa, which, if you're a brand new driver to Formula One, I would think racing at Spa for your first time in a Formula One car might be a little bit on the intimidating side. I don't know, but apparently it wasn't. It wasn't for Michael, because he took that beautiful Jordan F1 car, and if you've never seen the 1991 Jordan F1 car, it's absolutely probably one of the most top 10 beautiful F1 cars ever. It was absolutely gorgeous. And Schumacher jumped in that car, qualified 7th, and finished 8th, I believe, in his very, very first race. And so, of course, back in those days, I can remember it. I mean, people were just buzzing about this guy Schumacher. And so he was signed very quickly and kind of stolen away from Eddie Jordan by Flavio Briatore, who was running the Benetton team, to drive for them in 1992. And so in that season, he won his first Grand Prix at Belgium. So,
wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, you think about it, some of these guys, they get into Formula One and it's years before they even podium. I mean, think about Nico Hulkenberg. He's never podiumed, right? And here's Schumacher in basically a year winning his first Grand Prix. So pretty spectacular. There's been a couple of guys who I think won on their debut in Formula One, but that was in the late 50s, early 60s.
Wow.
Anyway.
Yeah. When you say that, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, that's probably a really good short subject podcast for us at some time.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I like that idea. We have so many different follow-ups to these conversations. I have to make sure I keep track of all of them. So I love when you say that he went to Belgium. Isn't it Belgium, the Grand Prix circuit is different than in the past? Like it's shorter now? Or am I total? Okay, so was it on that old track or was that on the newer layout?
That's on the newer layout, yeah.
Okay.
The old track, I'd have to go back and look at it, but the old track went away because it was 8 miles long. And think of it as sort of like having the same problems that the original Nürburgring had, except, of course, the Nürburgring was a little over 14 miles and like 200 corners, and Spa was not like that, but it was 8 miles something, 8.2 or something like that. And they cut it back to basically half that distance, which is the track that you're familiar with.
Okay. All right. Another slight aside. Have you listened to Eddie Jordan and David Coulthard's podcast?
I have not.
Okay, you totally have to listen to it. I know I'm giving another podcast a shout out, but I totally have enjoyed listening. First off, their accents are amazing. And then the stories that Eddie and David give, the color that they give is so much fun. I love listening to them as I'm walking. And then I start chuckling in the neighborhood, and people must think I'm a little crazy because I'm laughing at everything these two are saying that are comical. So slight shout out, if they ever listen, we would love to collaborate with them. But I wanted to make sure.
That.
Well, when you say his story, I just think, oh, wow, that would be so fun to hear him tell us exactly how it was that, the whole finding Michael, and then, of course, how he got pulled away to Benetton. That would be fun. Okay, I got you off track twice. Let's get back on track. What happened after he signed on to Benetton?
So, he wins his first race in 92, went on and won 2 world championships and 18 races during his 4 years with Benetton. But, he kind of developed a bit of a reputation as a bad boy because there was some pretty aggressive driving on his part that, wound up resulting in the occasional collision with some of his rivals, notably Damon Hill. And so it definitely was a case of, it sure looked like he had punted Damon Hill in at least one race. And in addition, during his first world championship, that was somewhat tainted by questions surrounding the legality of his car. And believe it or not, it had to do with the wooden plank underneath the car that was called into question, much like the whole question that we had last year about the wooden planks grinding away at Coda during the U.S. Grand Prix. So, the more things change, the more they stay the same, as they say. Anyway, the lure of Ferrari came up, and of course, this is where he made his famous move to Ferrari in 1996. And at the time, and I realize this sounds like a broken record, but Ferrari was in complete disarray. That's normal. And they hadn't won a world championship since Jody Scheckter won the world championship in 1979. So, they'd gone, 16, 17 years, something like that, I guess. Long time, 17 years. And so, it was one of those things where, try as they might, and they had some great drivers like Prost and Mansell, but they could not get it done. So here comes Schumacher. And in 1996, he had 3 wins with them, and then another 5 in 1997. But after he tried to run Jacques Villeneuve off the road in the final race of the year because they were fighting it out for the world championship, his punishment was that his second place in the championship was stripped from him as punishment for his driving. So, that kind of put a damper to it. But then the following year, things didn't go so well either. He finished second in 1998, and then in 99, he broke his leg during the British Grand Prix, and that put him out for the remainder of the year. As it was, the car was pretty good, and Eddie Irvine came very close to winning the world championship himself. Irvine was Schumacher's teammate, and so with the team leader out, healing his broken leg, it was up to Irvine to represent the Scuderia, and he came very close to doing it. So the car was good. So when Schumacher came back in 2000, he just went on this amazing run where he won 5 world championships in a row. And so he finished that streak with 91 victories and a total of 7 world championships, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah. That is, like, when I hear you say 91 victories, that's, especially considering the volume was not the same volume of races a year like we have now, right?
Absolutely, right.
So that's just consecutive years of just keeping that optimal focus, discipline, everything that makes you a champion over and over. Okay, let's go backwards for just a second. You said that he was stripped of his champion or second place in the championship as a punishment. So that's interesting. How did that come again? what was there a specific incident that they just
Yeah, it was the last race of the year, and he and Jacques Villeneuve were fighting it out. Villeneuve was driving for Williams.
Mhm.
And so basically Schumacher made an attempt to give Jack the big punt off the road in an attempt to get ahead of him and win the race and therefore the championship. Well, it didn't work. Villeneuve was certainly his car was upset by the hit, but the car continued on, and Schumacher did not get past him. And at the end of the day, as punishment, they stripped him of his second place finish in the world championship.
wow.
Yeah.
I
I'd
mean,
forgotten all about that.
that's like today when we talk about, the calls and decisions and the controversies, especially what was it, the one, what I always forget the year, the Abu Dhabi 2021, right?
21. Yeah. 21.
That was the one that's the most recent one. I always want to think it's 22, but it's 21. And how everyone's still talking about that. This being stripped of your position. I mean, wow. That's like, I don't know that it's just shocking to me because all the years worth of work, the team, especially when you say Ferrari hadn't been doing so great, shocker. And then for this to happen and how that would affect the following year, wow. And then to come back and keep going in trying to win the 98 and then 99 and then to have the injury. I mean, that just shows a lot of persistence, relentless pursuit that I don't necessarily know that we fully can grasp in 2024, not having witnessed it and kind of gone through the ups and downs. But you also said that his move to Ferrari was famous, but then we've also recently had another kind of significant move to Ferrari, Lewis Hamilton. Don't know when and where this will air and how long it'll stay. So who knows? This could be listened to in 2025 and people will be laughing at us. But it seems very interesting that we're seeing such a multi-year champion follow the footsteps of another multi-year champion, hoping to maybe reach that holy grail, as John has called it. And then even, I thought about this, the Jacques Villeneuve aspect. I will have to get John to tell us a soundbite for that at some point, since he's not able to join us for this recording. But that's, I know, one of his racing heroes. So I guess then my question would be, how do you see Schumacher's impact on this era, on the sport? Kind of, you alluded to it, but do you want to kind of extrapolate a little bit more?
Yeah, I think obviously he was just this natural talent. You don't win your first championship when you're 6, to not, not have a bunch of just latent talent. He also had an incredible brain and a work ethic that was legendary. And this was a work ethic that was, whether he was in the gym or with his team working on the engineering of the car, whatever it was, he just had this enormous work ethic. And one of the things I think that he brought to the sport really was he kind of redefined what driver fitness should look like. He no doubt trained harder than any driver of his era. And then you combine that with his talent and the fact that he's just a very intelligent person. He was able to make, those split second decisions, and size up a situation and make a split second decision as to what he was going to do on the track. Made him really, really tough to beat. And then there was a lot of people who talked about the fact that he was a very smooth driver, so he was easy on the car. And the fact that he had done so much mechanical work of his own, he had a lot of mechanical sympathy, which, if you think about it, it's very similar to somebody like a Fangio, who started as a mechanic, a Graham Hill, who started as a mechanic, Jackie Stewart, started as a mechanic. All those guys were mechanically aware, and that seems to be a trait that pays off very well. And so I think he did a lot of things, and I think one of the other things he did is he showed everybody how to make the team your own.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
so
Well, when you talk about the mechanically aware, it makes me think that that's like the marriage of art and science, which is racing, right? Like
well said.
you know the technical, but you have to feel it. And it's something I think both of you have said to me, just doing the laps, you just start to feel it. And it's making me think that this also maybe alluding to future conversations of legends, but like I've heard some of the same things that you said just now about Michael. Commentators have talked about Max Verstappen or Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, all these other champions. This talent merged with the dedication, the discipline, and the split-second decision making that they make. Yep. And it sounds like he being Michael set that precedent, which everybody else has really been measured against. And I also kind of wonder if you think that even now, every team and team principal is really hoping as they look at rookies and drivers in general, that they're trying to find that again, recreate it for their own efforts, especially we're recording this in 2024, the first time in the history of F1 where you haven't had a change on the grid. There's not a single rookie. And I just have to wonder if it's not necessarily intentional, but everyone knows that it's a possibility. So they're kind of holding out hope that they can recreate that magic again, which really isn't magic because it's so much as you've laid out the case. So much of this, when you look in hindsight, you can see the building blocks that allowed for a Michael Schumacher level of talent and execution to actually come into being. And whether or not that can be recreated, I don't know. That.
Yeah. I mean, well, yeah. And can it be recreated? Yeah, to a certain degree, for sure. But man, you've just got to bring everything together at just the right time. Right. And you've got to have all the pieces. It's not just the driver, it's the team and the engineers and, everybody involved. The driver gets the glory, but boy, oh boy, if he doesn't have the right team behind him, we saw it when Schumacher came back from his first retirement and went to Mercedes, which was, a good team, but it wasn't a great team. They were being built. And I have always believed that Michael endured his time at Mercedes with no wins. But what he did is he shaped Mercedes into the team it needed to be so that when Lewis Hamilton showed up, Hamilton suddenly had this amazing team at his disposal. And as we know, he went on a win streak that was every bit as impressive as what Michael did. So.
Yeah. One thing that you said made me remember I had watched, I think it's a documentary that was put out by the Schumacher family, but they highlighted that Michael would sleep on the floor of the garage during testing, and he would be available to the engineers. And like when you talk about making the team your own, not just simply going and saying hello, but actually being there and being available to give back that kind of feedback. And now that you highlighted his mechanical prowess, it makes sense why he would want to have such accessibility and truly be one with his car. It makes a lot of sense now when I hear that. Yeah. So you noted his first retirement. Tell us what happens next in the story of Michael Schumacher.
Yeah, so he came back, raced a few years with Mercedes, and then finally retired for good. He decided that, he just didn't have the motivation anymore to race in Formula One. And so he stepped aside, was replaced by Lewis Hamilton, which at the time seemed like a real shock move on the part of Hamilton, but I think it worked out okay for Lewis. And what was sad about the whole thing was shortly after his second retirement, he went skiing with his family in France and had just kind of a minor wipeout. But for whatever reason, even though he was wearing a helmet and everything else, apparently there was a rock hidden underneath the snow, and his head hit that rock, and it caused a severe head injury. It put him in a coma for months. And to this day, we really don't know what sort of condition Michael's in. His estate and his net worth is, I guess, somewhere north of $1 billion. So his family is certainly well taken care of. But I mean, it's just this horrible, tragic story. Yeah, I mean, it's just really a shame that, here's a guy that, really only had one big crash that broke his leg. And then he goes skiing and was doing everything right. And he still wound up putting himself in the state that he's in today. Really sad.
Yeah, especially when you consider how many instances while he's driving, there are so many great risks. And for it to happen that, and that's something that every racer has to calculate and decide getting into that car. But this, as you said, it's so hard to hear you talk about that. Even when I watched the documentary, my heart broke for their family, because you can see how close they were.
Yep.
Or are. There's no reason to believe that they aren't now. And just the caregiving aspect of it. But we only hope for the best for him. Even now, there's still so much that medicine can do. Okay, so that is Michael Schumacher. The next person on your list, I was super excited to see you choose, and that was Mika Hakkinen. Can you tell us a little bit about Mika?
Yeah, so Mika, obviously, with a name like Hakkinen, he had to have been born in Finland, right? The more K's, I's, and N's that you have in your last name, it's just a dead giveaway. You have to be a Finn. And so
I love that.
And so he was roughly a year older than Michael. I think Mika was born in 1968. Michael was born in 1969. And so as a result, it was, because of their ages, it was kind of inevitable that Mika and Michael would have to face each other for the bulk of their careers. And certainly in the case of Hakkinen, he had to deal with Schumacher for all 11 seasons of Formula One. And of course, he was the only double world champion during the Schumacher era until Fernando Alonso came along and he won 2 world championships. But that was sort of, what put they were kind of like bookends, you might say. Michael had won a couple of world championships, lots of battles. In the ensuing years, Mika wound up winning 2 world championships before Michael went on his tear of 5 in a row. And what ended Michael's tear of 5 in a row was Fernando Alonso winning 2 in a row. So it's kind of interesting to think about Mika and Fernando and how they certainly played a big role, really, in many respects, with Michael Schumacher's career. Hakkinen was known for being really, really fast, very consistent, and brave. And he liked to be flat out all the time.
Wow.
He started karting at the age of 5. And by the time 1986 rolled around, he was a 5-time karting champion and the protege of Keke Rosberg, who was the 1982 world champion. And of course, he was Nico Rosberg's dad, or is Nico Rosberg's dad. So Keke basically saw to it that he had the funding necessary for Mika to go up the ladder into single seaters. And so over the next 4 years, he won 5 championships in the various junior formula, meaning that at least 1 year he ran 2 championships in the same season, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. And so he made his Formula One debut at Team Lotus in 1991, just as Michael did with Jordan. And, Lotus was on the decline. Car wasn't very good. After a couple of seasons, he was signed by McLaren, kind of taking a little bit of a step back. In 1993, he would be the backup driver, or the test driver, if you will, for Ayrton Senna and Michael Andretti, who were the 2 primary, drivers in Formula One for McLaren in 1993. And strangely enough, for whatever reason, after the Italian Grand Prix, where Andretti finished third on the podium after the Italian Grand Prix. McLaren sacked Michael. And there were 3 races to go in the season. And so Hakkinen was brought in to replace Michael Andretti. And sure enough, Hakkinen goes out in his first race with McLaren, and he outqualified Senna. So it was sort of like, okay, well, I guess this kid really can drive. So when Senna made his move to Williams in 1994, which of course, sadly we all know, that was the year that Senna had his fatal accident. Hakkinen came to become the team leader at McLaren with only, really 3 races under his belt with the team. Now, of course, he had 2 years of racing with Lotus, but he became the team leader as a guy who was very, very new to the sport, really, and certainly to McLaren. So they ran 1994, and then in 1995, he had 7 podium finishes, but then at the Australian Grand Prix, which was still held at Adelaide at that time, some debris punctured a tire and pitched his McLaren straight into one of the barriers. Really a big hit. And they found that Hakkinen was critically injured. He was bleeding from the mouth and turning blue from lack of oxygen. And so, the FIA now, of course, in large part because, Jackie Stewart and his crusade for driver safety and having consistent medical treatment facilities and all that, by this time they had Sid Watkins, who was a medical doctor, and he performed an emergency tracheotomy on Hakkinen, basically opening his throat and inserting a tube into his throat so he could breathe. And then they transported him to the hospital, and he really was kind of touch and go there for quite a while. However, he was back in a Formula One car in early 1996 at a special test that McLaren organized for him just to see if he could still drive. Did this accident really impact him? There was a lot of questions about it because one of the side effects of the accident was that it had caused partial hearing loss in one of his ears. And so anyway, there was genuine concern that he may never be able to race again. But apparently Hakkinen wasn't all that fazed because he got in the car and was immediately as fast as ever. So that problem was taken care of. So.
Can I interrupt you there?
Sure.
Okay. I think what you just said needs to be a movie.
I agree. That's a great idea.
I love the movie Rush and how it highlights the relationship between Lauda and James Hunt. But what you just said here, that's a whole nother movie. If anybody takes this idea, they need to give me some royalty rights on this. But, I'm sitting here imagining this, the rivalry, as you noted, between Michael and Mika, the signing, and then of course the departure from Michael Andretti from McLaren, and Senna leaving. Like, these are so many different moments of really good action. There's no reason to go create a story. It's already there. It just needs to be talked about. I have to also say, I have a profound respect for Mika. All the interviews I've watched him do whenever he's on the track and he gets to talk, like if he's done some commentaries while we're in free practice. I can't remember which one it was, but he's done a few, and I always walk away going, what an articulate, intelligent individual. And then when you say the accident actually affected his breathing, and I know what traumatic brain injuries can do to a person, it's even more profound that he is as capable as he is. And I'm kind of befuddled. And on the last piece I'll say is John recently sent us a video where Mika is being interviewed. It's probably from the late 90s, I think, or the early 2000s, somewhere in Monaco. And the way that he's able to recall stuff and talk about things, again, such a good person to still have in the sport, in the way that he is, considering everything that he's endured. So I say all that, just kind of chiming in that I'm really glad that you chose Mika as one of the people to discuss. But I know you probably have a little bit more to bring us into the ending of his official career as a Formula One driver.
Yeah. So what was interesting is that, he finally won his first race at the very end of the 1997 season in Jerez, Spain. And then in 98 and 99, he won the world championship again. He won 8 races in 1998. And then in 1999, after winning that, he also won races in 2000 and 2001. And then he did something that was really, really unique and very unlike any other driver up to that time, other than maybe Jackie Stewart. And that was, he just said, you know what? I'm going to take a year-long sabbatical. I'm just going to spend more time with my family. I've got little kids and I just want to be a dad for a year. And at the time, Ron Dennis at McLaren said all the right things, that Mika would always have a seat there and, all those great things. But at the end of the day, he never returned to the sport. And so, and he's, like you were saying, he's a commentator, he's a spokesman for Mercedes. And in fact, if you ever want to just have some fun, go out onto YouTube and look up Mercedes television commercials that feature Mika Hakkinen, Michael Schumacher, Nico Rosberg, those kind of guys. They are some delightful advertisements. They are really fun.
I'm putting that on my list right now.
I actually need to do that too, because I haven't watched them in probably 5 years. And first time I watched them, I just started laughing because it was just too good.
You think I'm joking? I literally am writing that down. YouTube YouTube Mika. That's like a tongue twister right there.
Yeah, that's hard. That's hard. Give it up. Give it up.
I will. But okay, so he never returned to the sport in that official capacity
as a driver.
As a driver, but he is still remained in the sport, and as you said, as a spokesperson for Mercedes.
Yeah.
What do you think would be like the one thing that a person should take away from Mika's story?
Well, I think just by all accounts, and of course I've never met him, but by all accounts, he's just a phenomenal human being. The guy was a flat out racer, very fast, very brave, and yet he was just this real easygoing, likable kind of guy out of the car. And the fact that he retired the way he retired, you got to give him props.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so then let's move on to our final person that you have selected for this walk down memory lane of legends, Sebastian Vettel.
Yeah, so here's another, just amazing F1 champion. Again, another German, but he grew up in humble circumstances, just like Schumacher and many of the others that we've already talked about. And of course, he used karting to start his career at a very, very young age. Great story here. He won his first karting championship at the age of 7 and was presented his trophy by none other than Michael Schumacher, who was Vettel's absolute all-time hero. And if you've ever seen the pictures of Michael and young Sebastian, it's just sort of like, I don't know, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke Skywalker. It's just, it's just a remarkable picture, And anyway, Schumacher took a real interest in young Sebastian because he recognized that he grew up, that Sebastian was growing up in circumstances very, very similar to the circumstances that Michael grew up in, And so, really a really, really cool story. because of his success in karting, Red Bull picked him up at a very early age, and that's kind of what we've been talking about how these teams now are out scouting talent at the karting levels. And because the family didn't have any money really to help him progress up the ranks just in karting, because karting can become ferociously expensive. And so because of Red Bull, he was able to continue racing in the karting and eventually graduated into single seaters, and he won the German Formula BMW championship. And Formula BMW doesn't exist anymore, but think of it as kind of a Formula 3 car, not quite as fast, but similar to a Formula 3 car. And of course, it had a BMW engine. And anyway, it was a formula that was actually kind of a worldwide formula. I guess the closest thing that we have to it today would be something like Formula 4, where the cars are very similar, regardless of where you race, whether you're somewhere in Europe or in the United States or over in somewhere in Asia Pacific or Australia, something like that. Anyway, he won the German Formula BMW championship when he was 17 years old. He won 18 races out of 20. So just this immense talent, right? And so the following year, he tested in a Williams BMW Formula 1 car and acquitted himself very well, showed his potential. And so by the following year, when he was 19, he became a test driver for Sauber, which was also powered by BMW at the time. So we have no real big coincidences here. And he wound up driving for Robert Kubica, who at the time had been injured. And so he made his debut at the U.S. Grand Prix at Indianapolis. And he qualified for the race in seventh, just like his hero Schumacher did at Belgium, and he finished eighth. And so in doing that, he became the youngest ever driver to that date to score a world championship point. So that pretty remarkable way to, kick off your career in Formula One. And so that same year, he became a Toro Rosso driver, and he finished fourth later that year in China. And so from there, he was, feeling pretty good. And the following year, he won his very first Formula One race, which was at the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. It was rainy. He had qualified on pole, which was a shock, but then he went out and just dominated the race. And I remember watching it. It was just like, this is just not possible. This guy is a kid. And yet here he is out, handing it to all the big names, and that little team certainly, we know Toro Rosso, they've won one more race since then. And that was Pierre Gasly again at Italy. So, I guess Toro Rosso likes the Italian Grand Prix. So anyway, so that very next year, after having won for Toro Rosso, he was promoted to the Red Bull team, and he won 4 more races, finished second in the World Championship to Jenson Button. And remember, that's when Jenson Button was driving for Braun, and Braun had quite the technical advantage at that time. And so, not to take anything away from Jenson, but the fact that Vettel was able to win 4 races in a car that really was not the best car on the grid, and especially against the driver with the talent level of a Jenson Button, says a lot for him. But then 2010 hit, and just like Schumacher, he won 4 consecutive world championships. Well, sorry, Schumacher won 5, but in a row. But Vettel won 4 consecutive world championships, and during that time, he won over 30 races. Became the youngest ever world champion in 2010. And he finished his run at world championships at the age of 26, which, if you think about it, when Fangio won his 4th consecutive championship, Fangio was 45 years old. So that really demonstrates to you the difference after 50 years, call it, the difference between, the sport in the mid to late 1950s versus the sport in the 2000s. It's pretty amazing. But what happened after that is that the regs changed, the regulations changed. The car that Red Bull developed was a little bit not to Vettel's liking, and he really started struggling. I mean, he did win some races, but by 2015, he really become quite dispirited. He didn't win a race in 2014. And so he went to Ferrari in 2015, no doubt, hoping to do for Ferrari what his hero Schumacher had done. And so in 2015, he won 3 races at Ferrari.
Can I interrupt you again?
Sure, of course.
Before you go to his time in Ferrari, I kind of want to just ask a couple of questions about his time at Red Bull. Red Bull, when they picked him up, that was fairly early in Red Bull's existence, right?
Correct. And it's the iteration of Red Bull, because remember, before that, it was Jaguar, and before that, it was Stewart. So the team, and I'm using that in air quotes, had been around, but it looks nothing, even in 2010, it looks nothing like it did when it was, say, Jaguar.
Right. Because this is the time where it's developed, where it's kind of, in my mind, I think of them as bringing together the various pieces that are going to be eventually the components for their success. And they were really kind of known during that time as being like the party team, right? They really leaned into that.
The edgy, kind of edgy, hip kind of team. Yeah, exactly.
And so do you think it was a bit of like a gamble on their part for them to take on him, this rising, promising talent, to join them? You know, maybe because of the way that their shop was run, they had more risk tolerance, which created that opportunity for Seb.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of that. Plus, you think about it, Red Bull, they're going to be marketing to young people. Mark Webber, when Sebastian arrived at Red Bull, he was 10 years older than Sebastian, I think. And so, while he was still a young man, Vettel was younger.
Right. Right.
And so you've got a guy who's, in his early 20s versus a guy in his early 30s. And so from a marketing standpoint, maybe it wasn't a little bit of a risk, but from a marketing perspective, probably wasn't a risk at all. And then he started winning, and everybody was thinking, oh, well, aren't we smart? One of those deals. Yeah.
Okay. That's really, because I'm intrigued by the way that Red Bull took, as you said, these pre-existing team, rebranded it, rebuilt it in so many different ways. And then then it was super successful. And this component, kind of going back to what we'd said with Michael and Ferrari, the synergy of driver and team as they kind of find their way. It's intrigued me about Red Bull. Okay. So that is, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you think about the transformation from Stewart Grand Prix, which won races, to Red Bull, right? And the rebranding and all that kind of stuff. Think about what Mercedes started as, which was Tyrrell, which of course ran Jackie Stewart and all that. They eventually became Honda, and Honda eventually then became Braun, and then Braun eventually became Mercedes. So, talk about rebranding and all that kind of stuff, but the DNA that goes for those teams, both of them, it's really remarkable, Yeah,
especially in 2024 when we've had a number of rebrands that everybody's kind of questioning what's going on. Why are they choosing some of these names? Right. Are they going to be able to move up and start challenging? I just find it fascinating to look back at these moments in the history of the sport to see where were lessons learned, where, it's just maybe, again, we all know I'm a nerd, but I don't want to divert us too far from the track, which is really about Seb Vettel. And so Seb is going to go to Ferrari largely because he's become, as you said, dispirited from what's happening there. So tell us a little, he's following kind of in Michael's footsteps in that sense, right?
He's absolutely following in Michael's footsteps. And I think the other thing to remember is that in 2014, Seb didn't win a race, but he had this really fast young teammate named Daniel Ricciardo, and Ricciardo won 3 races. So, that did not set well with Vettel. So he goes to Ferrari, and sure enough, he wins 3 races, which, again, we know how dysfunctional Ferrari can be, and they were really dysfunctional by that time. Alonso had left them in disgust because it was sort of like, yeah, I am not going to win here. I'm going to go somewhere else. And so he wins 3 races for Ferrari, and this, of course, was at a time when Mercedes was just absolutely destroying the competition. But then in 2016, he failed to win a race. And, I remember thinking at the time, and you just see him, he was, angry. He was making mistakes. Ferrari was making mistakes. I mean, they were just shooting themselves in the foot. And, but they kind of regrouped. And in 2017, they won 5 races. But, it was one of those years where, he was either brilliant or just really pretty average, or maybe even worse. And 2017 was the year that, he punted Lewis Hamilton into the safety car at Baku. And everybody was like, what on earth is he thinking, And then there was another time when he won pole at Singapore, and then going into the turn 1, right after the start of the race, he had a crash and, took out a bunch of people and all that kind of stuff. And so all those moves hinted at just his desperation to try to make it work and not only win another championship, but also emulate his hero. And it just wasn't happening, right? And so the constant drain of the just dealing with the dysfunction at Ferrari, I think, and the disappointment and the pressure he put on himself, I think it was a combination of things. He was really becoming mentally destroyed. And then I think what really finished him off was that Ferrari brought in Charles Leclerc, your boy, and he sort of finished Sebastian off. Leclerc was quick. He won races when Sebastian couldn't, and really, he was there with Ferrari for 6 years. And at the end of the 2020 season, Ferrari said, yeah, we're not going to renew your contract, Seb. Thanks. It's been a great run, but we're done with you. And so, and he got the news, of course, earlier on in the season. And so he really became very dispirited, and, there was the evidence of the desperation in his driving, and, he felt rejected and humiliated, and really it just left him in a state where he just was not performing well at all in that final year. And so for people who did not see the brilliance of Vettel, in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, the Vettel that they saw is nothing like the guy that won 4 world championships. He was thrown a lifeline by Aston Martin, and he spent his last 2 years of his career at Aston Martin. And really, in some respects, I think that he did for Aston Martin what Michael did for Mercedes, and that he helped them to start establishing some of the fundamental things that had to be done to transform what was Racing Point and now was Aston Martin into a team that was not at the back of the midfield, but rather nipping away at the front. And of course, Racing Point did win a Grand Prix. Aston Martin has yet to win a Grand Prix, but I think that we'll certainly see Aston Martin up at the front of the pack here before too long. But what's really, really interesting is towards the end of his career, he became very concerned about environmental issues. He was known as a guy that donated a lot of money to various causes, whether it was earthquake victims or what have you. And he is a very, very much the family man. And so, he was quoted as saying that his greatest accomplishment was his wife and kids. And so you can't ever knock somebody like that. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
He He drove in 300 Grand Prix, which is an amazing number to think about right there. But he won 53 of them. And so if you think about it, he had a 25% win record. And I'd take a 25% win record.
That's right.
I'd do that in a New York second. If you think about it, Jackie Stewart drove in 99 races and he won 25 of them. So he had basically a 25% win record too. And so that kind of gives you an idea of Vettel's greatness. And
not to mention the world championships either.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, for sure. And so anyway, it's tough to compare drivers from different eras. So I kind of like winning percentages because that way, then if you have a car that's fast but unreliable, if you do manage to win races with that fast, unreliable car, it does show up as a statistic, even though you probably won't win a world championship. So anyway, those are my 3 for this segment.
Yeah, I think when we listen to Seb and his story, Ferrari onwards, I feel like, again, I don't know where this episode will air, how long it'll air, but it's definitely a cautionary tale for Lewis, in my opinion, that, he needs to be I hope that he's having some offline conversations with Seb and other people who've worked inside the Ferrari world, not to mention, the people he knows inside that world itself. And maybe he can do as Michael did, the first person that you brought up, and not walk away from the sport like Seb, or at least walk away from Ferrari with maybe some of these feelings that you have inferred based off of his statements and actions and things. But I do love this thing that you mentioned about Seb's interest that is outside of the sport, this environmental, largely because if he can do for the sport what you've mentioned multiple times, Jackie Stewart has done in the role of safety. If Seb can have a positive influence on environmental impact and things and efficiency and stuff like that I think he cares about when it comes to Formula One, who knows what people will be saying about him 20, 30 years down the road and how he has positively helped the sport, because it is something we want to be mindful of without destroying what makes the sport as awesome as it is. I think it's a delicate balance, and who better than someone who's been inside the sport and given his all, just like Jackie Stewart has done for safety. Because I know that some of the times we've talked offline, I feel like you and me and maybe John and myself, we've talked about the different safety things that people have advocated for, that initially there was a little bit of resistance, I guess, but now we've seen the value of it. So it's part of the progress of the sport as a whole, not just simply the technological. Well, I love what you have told us, Dick, overall in these 3 amazing racers. This is around the time that I started to become aware. I didn't really start following really probably until Seb's time, but even then I wasn't nearly as focused. Now we're coming closer and closer to the decades that I might have some moments of watching and go, oh yeah, I remember that. So I look forward to the next Legends conversation with you.
Absolutely.
Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, Sabrina@2guysaGirlandF1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.